On this week's episode of What Have I Been Photographing, I'm going to show you some photos of Johnny's incredibly clean Mazda RX-7. I personally love this set. Now, if you're following me on Instagram, you would have already seen them. However, if you're not, then now's the time to pause the video and go follow at Shooting Dave. We are going to be focusing on the front 3/4 and how I photographed it. Basically, I'm going to take you through all of the gear that I used to do it, the camera settings, the different lighting exposures, and then how I took all of those and combined them inside of Lightroom and Photoshop to get the final product. What is going on, guys? Shooting Dave here. So good to see your faces. Welcome back to the channel. Now, if you're new here and you don't know what I'm about, well, I'm a photographer from London that now lives here in Los Angeles, and I make photo and video editing tutorials. So, if that sounds like something of interest to you, then please do consider subscribing. Before we get going, I want to make sure that everyone is up to speed. Now, the technique that I use to photograph these images is called light painting. For the uninitiated, that means a long exposure while I walk around the car, illuminating sections of it with a very bright LED light. I then take all of those exposures and merge them together inside of Photoshop. Okay, now that we're all up to speed, let's go over some of the gear that I use to take these images. First piece of gear that I have is the camera, and for that is my Canon 5D Mark III with a Canon 35mm f2 non-IS lens on the front. That's what I use for most of my images. Next up, we have a tripod which you guys are currently sat on. It's the Manfrotto 055 X Pro B. Pretty decent tripod, not too expensive. I've had it for a bunch of years and it's never let me down, so I'm happy to carry on using it. Moving on, we also have the Canon TC80N3 intervalometer, or remote if you don't know what intervalometer means. Basically, I can dial in any shutter speed I want on this. I can have a delay, and it means that I don't have to touch the camera when I'm taking photos, which will prevent any of those misaligned images. The bit that everyone asks me and everyone wants to know is, what light do I use? And well, I have the Camera Plus CP MTL2 light. Now, basically, it has two modes, which is 5600 Kelvin, or if you put the orange gel over the top, it goes down to 3200 Kelvin. And it's pretty damn bright. It does a very good job. I'm very happy with this. I've had it for a number of years now, and my only concern is that it keeps changing brands, which makes me worried that they're going to discontinue it sometime, but for now, I love using this. And if you want any of the gear or you want to have a closer look, then I've left a link down in the description to all of it below, so you can go and check it out in your own time. Now let's talk camera settings. This was a completely dark environment, which meant that I had full control over what light I put into the scene. So that meant I had to light the car. I also had to light the background as well. Now, pro tip here, don't forget to light your background as well as your car. The two are just as important if you want to make them blend nicely together. The camera settings were exactly the same for every single exposure. I had my camera set up on bulb mode, which meant that I can open up the shutter for as long as I wanted. I had my white balance dialed in custom at 5600 Kelvin, so it matched the light that I had. My ISO was 100, aperture was f5.6, and the shutter speed was 10 seconds with a 10-second delay, which I used my remote to control. Oh yeah, and one other thing, I had my image review set to hold. That meant every time I took a photo, that photo would remain on the back of the camera until I took the next photograph. I did this so that I don't have to touch the camera when trying to review the image, and it wouldn't disturb the camera in between takes. Oh, and for the light, well, that ranged from anything from 10% power to 40% power. Typically I use 40% for the larger sides of the car, so basically down the side, around the front, around the rear, and then 10% for when I'm lighting the wheels. Okay, that's the basics taken care of. Let's move on to lighting. Now, typically I light my vehicles in order, so I'd start with the side, and then move on to the front, then go around and do the wheels, and then I'll take care of the background. Now, basically I don't move on to the next step until I'm 100% happy with each exposure. So I'll carry on going down the side over and over and over again until I got the exposure just right and just how I want it. And I'll do this every step of the way. I like lighting the cars in sections. It's just a logical way of doing it for me. I find it much easier for my mind to visualize it, what it's going to look like, and it's much easier when it comes to editing them in post. But rather than me tell you, let me just show you the exposures that I used. So once I got back from the shoot, basically I just dumped the cards, imported them into Lightroom, and then I made some basic adjustments. Really nothing fancy going on here. I just lifted up the shadows, dragged down the highlights, removed all sharpening, and then applied lens corrections. And once I'd found all the exposures that I want, I basically synchronized these settings all the way across them. Basically once all that is done, I then select all of the photos, go up to the top, hit photo, edit in, then open as layers inside Photoshop. Now what this will do is it'll load all of those photos into the Photoshop, and they'll put them on a nice stack, so everything's in one file, so everything will be on top of each other, and we can start working with it from there. Before I do anything else inside of Photoshop, I go to Edit, Auto Align, and align all of those images, because even though it's on a tripod and even though I didn't touch the camera, sometimes there can be a little or very slight movement, and you don't want any misaligned layers ruining a day, because, well, that would just suck. So yeah, auto align your layers, it's always a good thing to do. Once I've done that, I then go through each layer and give it a name, so this way I know what part of the car that I'm working on. As I go through and rename each exposure, I also organise them and split them into two groups. So I put one set into a folder called car and one set into a folder called background. This way I know which exposures belong where, and when it comes to editing, I can edit the car separately to the background rather than trying to fight each other. This is just a workflow that I've developed over the years and one that I like to stick to. It means if I have to come back for any reason and re-edit these photos, I know where everything is, and I just like to stay organised and have my Photoshop files nice and neat. Once done, I then select all the layers and set them to lighten. This will basically take the brightest parts from each image and make it visible on the layer below, so that way you can see all of the exposures working together. Once I've done that, I then add on an exposure adjustment layer, crank up the exposure a little bit, as well as the gamma. Now this will allow me to see deep inside those shadows, which brings me on to the next step, which means masking out the car. So basically I take the pen tool and I click and drag around the car, taking my time nice and accurately, going around the car, making sure that I'm not wavering from the edges. And once I've done that, right click on it, hit make selection, give it a feather if you want to, and that way you can put a mask on your car group so that everything in that group will only affect the car and not the background. Oh, and make sure you cut out your windows and your spoilers if they intersect with the car. Now, for those of you who don't know how to use the pencil, I suggest you start learning, and I've actually made a little tutorial for you to check out right up here. Okay, so once you have everything organised inside Photoshop, all you need to do now is basically just brush through the exposures where you want them, and you can use standard Photoshop adjustment layers to adjust those exposures if you want to. So I'm going to walk you through all the steps that I took on this image. So here we got one shadow pass here, which is what you're seeing on screen, and then I had another one which I put over the top and set the mode to lighten. You can see here it is actually masked off, so if I disable this mask, you can see how much it's flooding out in this background, but I didn't really like any of that and I only wanted this portion down here, so let's turn this mask back on and you can see it's just illuminating that. I'm not worried about what's happening to the car, we're going to get to that in a second, and this layer is set to lighten. Now the background is also quite messy, there is some grime on the wall here and splotches every now and then, and this looks to be a bit of exhaust dust up against the wall, so I did a bit of clean up just to get rid of all of those. You can see I've actually cleaned out part of the car. Then we got some curves, so basically just dropping the exposure down in the midtones here, and this was basically set to the background, so I'm darkening down that wall, and then I feathered it onto the floor a little bit as well, and then I took some of the hue and saturation out of that because I felt like it was a little bit red and that really wasn't doing it for me. And then we got some just basic contrast adjustments in the curves, so basically just dropping down the shadows and highlights and then pushing up some contrast in there. And then just a little bit more of hue saturation, taking out some of that red and keeping it a bit more neutral, but also retaining the blue reflection of the car, because I thought that was pretty cool. So that's all of the background taken care of, and now as you can see, the car looks awful, but don't worry, we're going to be working on that one next. So the largest exposure that I used was the side exposure for the car, so if we turn that one on, we can see that it's set to normal, and this is basically the side reflection that I did. On top of that, I went round to the front, which we can turn on here, and I added a little curves adjustment onto that, basically just darkening it down a bit. So if we look at this curves, we can drop the midtones. I also pulled down the highlights quite a bit as well, just so it didn't overpower the car. I wanted the light source to feel like it was coming from the left hand side of the car. And then moving around, I've got another front exposure, which is only masked in to the very front splitter, because this is actually showing off the carbon nicely that's actually in this front splitter. So if we zoom in here, you can see all this lovely carbon work, and if I take this off, you can see how dark it is, and it wasn't really drawing much attention, and I'd wanted to bring that out, seeing as someone went to all that work to make that out of carbon fibre. It'd be a shame just to lose it. So yeah, that's what that's on for. And if we look at this, I actually put a curves adjustment again on top of that, just darkening it down a little bit so it's not too overpowering. Then we have some more carbon around the sides, which I actually use for the interior. So if we have a look at this exposure, if I disabled the mask, you can see that it's disgusting around the front of the car, but what it's doing quite nicely is actually lighting up the cockpit. So just had that turned on, so just brushing in a little bit of light into the cockpit right there, and that's set to lighten as well. Then onto the wheel exposures, got the front wheel here. Again, nothing fancy, it's just, this is the full exposure, and then I just masked it, so if you look at the little mask, it's just brushing it over the wheel itself. Same for the rear wheel, and then I added a little bit of contrast into that rear wheel as well, because I felt like it was getting a bit brighter than front. So dropping down the mid-tones, and I think I took some of the... No, I didn't. I imagined that entirely. So yeah, just taking out some of the exposure out of the rear wheel. Then we have just a general curves layout. Now this is actually just darkening down the far side of the car. So if you look at this mask, this is just loosely brushed in around the side of the car just to help bed it in against that dark wall, seeing as it looked a bit milky like this, and I wanted some of that contrast to come back. I then took one of the shadow layers from earlier in the background, and then I used this again on the car just to push a bit more heat into the back of the car, because I knew that I was going to be lighting the car from the rear, and I wanted that light to reflect that in the panel. So basically the back of the car to be brighter than the front of the car, because that's where the imaginary light source will be coming from. A little bit more curves work over the top of the car, a little bit more colour work, so basically just sampling the paint colour, making it as a solid colour, setting it to multiply, so we're burning it down into the paint. If we just look on this mask, it's just brushed around the very edges of the car. So if I come over here and have a little zoom in for you, you can see what this is doing. So if I turn this off, you can see you've got this dusty line around the car. This is actually the car reflecting the wall as the light is illuminating the car. So if we put this back on, it's just making that look a little bit more rich and a little bit more contrasty, which I think looks pretty nice. And then there's a slight bit of cleanup on the car, which is down here on the front bumper, so just tidying up this little highlight here, which I thought was a little bit messy, and I thought I could do a better job than that, so that's what that was for. So that takes care of the entire car itself. The only other thing that I did is I add a little flare into here, just up here. So if we actually have a look at this, if it's still there, you can see just a soft flare, which I put just outside the frame and blurred it a little bit, set it to screen, and then drop down the opacity, so that would help sell in this artificial light source that we have coming here. So light's coming down, hitting the side of the car, reflecting into the floor, and there's a nice shadow out in front. So that takes care of the Photoshop portion. The rest of the finishing that I do is inside Lightroom. I just prefer to do my color work inside of there. Don't ask me why, it's just my preference. I've done it that way for years. Some of you like to do it inside Photoshop. Nothing wrong with that. So if you do want to do it inside of Photoshop, you can skip this step, but otherwise you can just follow along and see how I did it in Lightroom. Okay, so now we're inside Lightroom, and this is the end result. If we press backspace on the keyboard, this is the before and then the after. So this is what it's like outside of Photoshop, and this is what it looks like inside Lightroom. Now, the first adjustment that I did was a little bit of a crop. I just rotated it and zoomed in a little bit more. And then we have the basics panel. And what I did here was drop the highlights, push the shadows, push the whites, and drop down the blacks. But a lot of that makes no sense to nobody. So let's press J on the keyboard and we can actually see why I made these decisions. So we can see we've got these red areas and blue areas overlaid on our image. Now what they mean is anything in blue means that the information has gone past black, and anything in red represents any information that has gone past white. A little bit of this is fine in your images. Typically you don't want it to be overly blue or overly red. Now when you're viewing on a mobile device or a screen or anything on digital, it looks fine, but when you come to printing it, information that's gone past white or black won't be able to print accurately, so therefore you'll just get a weird solid color and it won't look great. So try and balance it as much as you can. That's what I was doing inside the basics panel. Coming down to presence, I've put a bit more texture and clarity in there than I normally do, but seeing as we've got this cool garage space, I wanted it to feel a bit more Need for Speed-esque, and I liked driving some texture into this really cool floor. There's some really interesting patterns going on in there, and I wanted to pull that out as much as possible. I also added a bit of dehaze in there. This just adds a bit of tonal contrast. Now, because the light was bouncing off the bright white walls, it was making the car look a little bit dusty. So actually adding a little bit of dehaze here on this satin paintwork made it look a little bit more contrasty, so I liked that. I also added a little bit of vibrance, but took some saturation away. And this is just a personal thing. I like my images to look nice and punchy. Now let's move on to the tone curve. This is my favorite editing tool inside of Lightroom. And basically I just put a slight, very slight S-curve in there. So dropping down the shadows a little bit and also pushing up the highlights. But if we come and look in the blue channel, you can see I put an inverted S-curve. So I've actually pushed more blue into the shadows and pulled blue out of the highlights, which will introduce a little bit of yellow. Now if we go over to the green channel, you can see it's completely untouched. If we go to the red channel, you can see that I've taken the midpoint of that and dragged it down, which will introduce more cyan whilst taking away the red. And I really like the way that looks on that image. If we scroll down further, you can see that I've actually made a bit more of a deal about the blue and aqua colors in this car, because that satin wrap really is quite special. I love the way it looks, and I just wanted to celebrate that a little bit more with some luminance. So I didn't actually put any saturation into it or shift the hue, but what I did do was just make it a little bit luminescent, so brighter basically. As we're coming down, I didn't do anything in the color grading. I still like this tool, but I decided not to use it on this panel. And then if we go into sharpening, then you can see there's quite a lot of sharpening going in here. So the amount is set at 75. So if you press Option or Alt on your keyboard and then click and hold, it will show you what it's doing. You've got the radius here, which I set to 1 because like this is relatively sharp anyway. So if we look in here, you hold it down, you can see those are the edges that it's really going to be focusing on. And then if we look at detail, this is going to be more of a global thing. And then basically, because I added so much sharpening, that often makes your image look a bit uncomfortable, especially when you're viewing it at smaller sizes. So I put quite a lot of masking in there. So if we hold down Alt or Option on masking and then click, you can see any of the white areas are going to be sharpened and any of the black areas are going to be left completely alone. So you can see it's only really pulling out the edges of that car and a little bit of that detail in the carbon fiber. And my friends, that is the end result. What do you guys think? You got to see everything that I did behind the scenes on this one. You got to see all of the gear that I used, all of the settings that I used, the different exposures, and then you got to see how I put it together. So what do you guys think of the edit? Let me know down below in the comments section. Well, that is all from me, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you've got any comments or questions, let me know down below. If you haven't already, please do subscribe and follow me on Instagram. I am @ShootingDave, and as always, guys, I'll see you on the next one. See ya!